I do want to remind you that there will be some food next door in Ballroom 4 if you're hungry. I'm not sure how much, but we'll see how many we can feed. If not, there's the Wildcat Den downstairs that you can go to as well. It is a great honor that we have Bryan Newland here, the Assistant Secretary for the Interior and Indian Affairs. I want to thank Deanna Hemela, who is our government liaison officer at Northern, who really made it possible for him to be here. It's not easy to get someone as busy as him to come to a place to give a talk like this. In fact, he's headed to New Orleans directly after this, so wow. I'm jealous because I love New Orleans. But I'm so excited that he came and is here to speak on this topic. Bryan Newland is a citizen of the Bay Mills Indian community, Ojibwa, where he recently completed his tenure as the tribal president. Prior to that, Bryan served as the chief judge of the Bay Mills Tribal Court. From 2009-2012, he served as a counselor and policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior Indian Affairs, and he is a graduate of Michigan State University and Michigan State University College of Law. So, would you please welcome Bryan Newland.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Who's you? This is my kind of weather, I tell you. So I apologize for being a little bit late. I was up in Baraga, Lance, actually, earlier this morning, meeting with leaders from the Keweenaw Bay Indian community, where 3 of my 4 grandparents grew up and lived most of their lives up in Lance, Baraga. My grandfather was actually superintendent of Lance schools for a period in the 80s. My grandmother taught there before moving back down to Brimley, where she taught me music and band. And then my other grandma grew up in Ziba there on the res. So it's really, really nice to be home. I had a couple of Hilltop cinnamon rolls already this morning, and I'm going to grab a couple of pasties on my way out of town, because before I go to New Orleans, I'm actually stopping back in D.C. to get a new change of clothes, and my wife and daughter will be very happy for the pasties. I want to say miigwech thank you to Northern Michigan University for having me here today, giving me an excuse to come home to the UP, it's a real honor to be here with you. Also to mark National Native American Heritage Month as well. And I know that it's a federal holiday, the weekend before deer opener, and so the fact that there are so many of you sitting here and not out getting your camps ready means a lot to me, so thank you guys very much. I don't know how many of you know what the Department of the Interior is, or know even more about the bureaucracy and what the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs does. But the position that I now occupy was actually established after President Nixon. Of all people are surprised to learn President Nixon was a forceful advocate for Indian country and tribal self-determination, called for the creation of an Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs. And so I am the 14th person to serve in this role. It is a Senate-confirmed position, and I am now in this role responsible for helping to develop and administer the President's policies with respect to Indian Affairs and oversee the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Education, the Bureau of Trust Funds Administration, a whole bunch of other stuff that I won't bore you with. But it's a real honor to do this. And I'm only, in the history of this position, actually only the 3rd person to serve in this role after having been an elected tribal leader. And it's been a real interesting to have worked in this office, come home and be tribal leader, and then come back here, and I've had a 360-degree view of federal Indian law and policy I've also been Indian my whole life, and so have, know what it's like to live on the res, kind of at the whims of federal policy. But one of the things that I'm responsible for in this job is being the leading edge of the federal government's trust relationship with 574 federally recognized tribes. Each tribe is a sovereign government with its own government-to-government relationship with the United States. So some tribes are massive. Navajo Nation geographically is larger than the state of West Virginia, and it has almost 500,000 tribal citizens. Cherokee Nation has about 500,000 tribal citizens. And there are some tribal communities that might only have a few acres of land and a couple dozen tribal citizens. They span from the North Slope of Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of Florida in the Everglades, and everywhere in between. And so it's a big honor to be responsible for that government-to-government relationship. I mentioned, and it was in my bio, that I grew up at the Bay Mills Indian community where I served as tribal president. Bay Mills was one of the spots along the route of the Lewis Cass expedition back in 1820. And along with so many tribes in the Great Lakes, our own history is intertwined with that expedition, which I know is part of the symposium here today. That expedition and the activities that it encompassed had huge ramifications for the first inhabitants of Michigan and the Great Lakes. For the better part of 2 centuries, the federal government, following on from that expedition, used its federal powers to decide what life would be like for Indian people, for Alaska Native people, and decide what would be in our best interests. And they did this, we did this, I'm now a federal official, I have to remind myself, without consulting tribes, often using coercion and other means to force compliance from Indian people with federal decisions. The federal government used its powers to wage war against tribes, take their lands, break their economic systems, forcibly remove Indian people from their homelands, establish reservations to confine tribal people, and prohibit people from exercising their religious and cultural beliefs, to unilaterally abrogate treaties, and to even terminate the legal existence of Indian tribes. Now, during his time as governor of the Michigan Territory, Lewis Cass negotiated many different treaties with Indian tribes on behalf of the United States. I'm a lawyer, so I'll give you just a little sampling of my first, what would be like the first day of my class in my Indian law class when I used to teach. But treaties, if you look at the United States Constitution, Indian tribes and Indian people are referenced explicitly in the U.S. Constitution 3 different times. There is no other ethnic group, racial group, or social group, except for lawyers, that is explicitly mentioned in the Constitution like that. So the relationship with tribes as sovereigns is actually a constitutional relationship, which is why sometimes you see Supreme Court decisions with folks that might surprise you, you might consider to be ardent conservative constitutionalists writing some of the most pro-tribal opinions in the Constitution from the Supreme Court about Indian tribes, excuse me. But the Constitution also includes this other provision called the Supremacy Clause and the Treaty Clause. And the federal government has the ability, the United States has the ability to negotiate treaties with sovereigns. The United States doesn't negotiate treaties with the city of Marquette. It doesn't negotiate treaties with the Rotary Club. It negotiates treaties with foreign nations and Indian tribes. And the Constitution says that those treaties are the supreme law of the land. They preempt state law and local law. So Lewis Cass, when he was governor, negotiated a number of these treaties with tribes in the Great Lakes area. And many of those treaties resulted in tribes handing over their lands to the United States. And in fact, how many of you know what year Michigan became a state? Shout it out. 1837. In 1836, one of those treaties, the Treaty of Washington, was negotiated with Ojibwe and Odawa people here in Michigan and ceded about 40% of the lands that would comprise Michigan. So if you'll bear with me, I'll get my handy Michigan map here. It's about this area from Alpena down to the mouth of the Grand River, and then everything east of the Chocolate River here in the UP. And that land cession actually facilitated Michigan becoming a state in the United States. And so in that treaty, the tribes reserved rights to themselves. This is a structure, those of you who are familiar with the Constitution know that the Constitution delegates powers to the federal government and reserves powers to the people and to the states. Treaties work much the same way. And the courts have said whatever tribes didn't give up in their treaties, they kept for themselves as sovereign powers. So these tribes, through the Treaty of 1836, ceded much of the land in Michigan and allowed Michigan to become a state. And so you'll often hear people from Indian country talking about treaty rights and the rights that tribes reserved. And that's important. And it's also important to remember that a treaty isn't a one-way street. It's an agreement between two sovereigns. And Indian people aren't the only ones who have rights and benefits under those treaties. We all have benefits and rights under those treaties. The state of Michigan and the people of Michigan benefited from this treaty by having the land that became our great state. And so Lewis Cass helped to negotiate that treaty, but he didn't always necessarily respect the sovereign status of tribes or believe that these negotiations were agreements between sovereigns. And in many instances, as you all know, the state governments, local officials, private actors, the United States didn't always live up to the treaties and the commitments made in those treaties or actively work to undermine them. And that continued here in Michigan all the way up into the 1970s when we had a lot of legal battles over fishing here in the Great Lakes. I see Dave Nyberg here, my good friend from back at MSU. We've, in his work with the governor and in the state, when I was tribal leader, we had a lot of conversations about these issues. So that work, I'm giving you this history lesson, all that stuff that happened flowing out of that Lewis Cass expedition and the treaties that followed on from that are one chapter in the story that we're all living today here in Michigan. We're all directly connected to those things. My grandparents, my grandma who lived in Zeba, used to fish illegally in Lake Superior at night. They would wade into the water in the dark when it was illegal. Often they would have one of my aunties or uncles sitting behind in the truck with a shotgun to protect themselves in case anybody was coming to do them harm for fishing without a state license. The state of Michigan cited one of our tribal members from Bay Mills for fishing without a license. They seized his fishing net and prosecuted him in a case that went to the Michigan Supreme Court, ultimately reaffirmed that these treaty rights for tribes to fish still exist. And just last week, I believe it was, in a continuation of all of this history, all this story that we're living, Governor Whitmer actually returned that fishing net to the tribal president of Bay Mills Indian Community, who's the granddaughter of the man who set the net in the first place. So we're still living this, and the past is never actually in the past. So one of the first ways, going back to that time of Lewis Cass, the federal government pursued this policy of acquiring, taking Indian lands through these treaties, and also forcibly assimilating Indian people. And so at the Department of the Interior today, under Secretary Holland's leadership, we're working to shed light on this past, not for some gratuitous effort to just make people feel bad, because we're still living in this story, we're still living this history. It's necessary to understand it and to have a shared understanding of this history so that we can heal from it and move forward. Remember, in my job, I'm partially responsible for this nation-to-nation relationship that the United States has with sovereign tribes. And so we're engaged in this work to understand this history, to have an accurate accounting of it, so that our relationship moving forward between the United States, and we're all citizens of the United States, and the citizens of Indian nations, that relationship in the future doesn't look like what it looked like in the past. So early on in the president's administration, Secretary Holland announced the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative. And this is the first time in the history of our country that the federal government has ever accounted for its role in these boarding schools. And last year, we released the first volume of a report about what these boarding schools were, where they were, how many there were. This was the first time in the history of this country that we've done this. And Secretary Holland is the very first American Indian to ever serve as a cabinet official for the President of the United States. And this is the landmark stuff that happens when you bring all Americans to the table to engage in this work. So our report had a number of findings. And at the top of the list, we were able to demonstrate that these boarding schools were part of a policy of forced assimilation that was really aimed at taking land from Indian people, or severing the connection between Indian people and their land. So a little bit about why that is. We're all in the UP, so we all, I think, get along pretty well up here these days. We're not without our disputes now and then, but many of you are at least familiar with Anishinaabe people who live up here and know the connection between Indian people and our homelands. And it is a cultural belief, and it's a way of life. And so if the federal government's thinking back in the early days was, if we can sever that connection, the Indian people won't need all this land. And if they don't need all this land, it's available to us. I'm not yet old, but I don't think I'd call myself young anymore either. But we all know that as we get older, it gets harder to learn new things, right? And the federal government quickly found out, well, we can't take all these middle-aged Indian people and change who they are. So we got to get them young. And we've got to force Indian children to be different. And so these boarding schools were aimed at forced assimilation to disconnect Indian people from their lands. And it was a policy deliberately targeted at Indian kids. And all three branches of the federal government were involved: the executive branch, Congress, and even the courts. And multiple generations of Native kids were forced by the federal government to attend these schools. They were taken from their parents and their families without consent and sent to these schools. And the Supreme Court found that this was a lawful exercise of the federal government's authority under the Constitution. So before we began this work, we consulted with tribes about how they wanted us to undertake this investigation. We identified federal records that we would research, and we began to develop the first official list of federal Indian boarding schools and trying to also identify where they were and burial sites at these schools. So we keep these records, actually the federal government keeps these records in an underground cave in Lenexa, Kansas. And I've been to this place. It is a massive facility. It's not unlike that scene from Indiana Jones at the very end. I mean, you can drive big trucks down there, and there's just rows upon rows of boxes of files. And for this work, our team reviewed over 98 million pages of documents. And that was just for this first report. So we showed that between 1819 and 1969, the federal government operated or supported 408 of these boarding schools in 37 states or territories, including 5 here in Michigan, one of which was St. Joseph's in Baraga, where my great-grandmother attended, along with many other people from Bay Mills Indian community. Our report identifies all of these schools by name and location. Some of these schools operated across multiple sites. And while there were tens of thousands of Indian kids who were taken to these schools, many of them never made it home. Many of them died at these schools, were buried at these schools, often hundreds or even thousands of miles away from home. And in fact, I was actually a few weeks ago at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which was the site of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and was there with folks from the War College because there's a cemetery there that is filled with Indian kids from all over the United States. And they are working now with tribes to bring some of those kids home so that they could be buried in their homelands. We've identified through our work so far that there were at least 53 marked or unmarked burial sites. And in our continuing research, and we'll be reporting on that later, I expect that that number will increase. Our research and investigation shows that 50% of federal Indian boarding schools received support or involvement from religious organizations that includes funding, infrastructure, and personnel. And the federal government at times actually paid religious institutions on a per capita basis for Indian children to enter and attend these schools. Our investigation also shows that the federal government used money held in individual trust accounts to fund Indian kids attending these boarding schools. So you might want to be asking, well, what does that mean? When the federal government broke up Indian reservations under allotment, it assigned 160-acre parcels of land to individual Indians, often, and then any activity occurring on those lands, if somebody was drilling for oil or grazing or farming those lands, they would pay rent. The federal government would hold that rent and then pay it out to the landowners. That practice still continues today. And we hold that money in trust at the Department of the Interior. And so what the department would do, oftentimes, to pay for the cost of these schools, would say, I know you're supposed to get this money to put food on the table for your family, but we're actually going to hold this money, take your kid, send them hundreds of miles away to this boarding school, and that money will pay for our expense of doing that. So not only were people deprived of their property through the allotment process, their kids were taken, and then they paid for that privilege as part of this policy. Our federal records also show that, as I think many people are aware of with these boarding schools, that they also worked really hard to keep kids from learning and speaking their own language. And that's one of the reasons why today, There are so few native language speakers in Indian country, and that a lot of the education that occurred at these schools was focused on skilled trades and not reading, writing, and arithmetic, so that the people who would leave these schools could be bricklayers and domestic servants and working class and not advance in their academic education. In our research and our investigation, we also found that through ongoing studies, known as the Running Bear studies, that the present day health of Indian people was affected by people in their family who went to these boarding schools. So people who didn't attend these schools themselves, but maybe their mom or their grandma or their grandpa did, suffer negative health impacts today because of their family's experience. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But our work on this has been path-breaking. And we haven't confined ourselves to this cave in Lenexa, Kansas, looking at federal records. We also went out, Secretary Holland and I did, on a tour over the past year and a half across the country called the Road to Healing, where we would sit in large rooms, often high school gyms, and hear from people who went to these schools and hear from their family members about their experiences. This is one of the hardest things that I've done in my career, to sit and watch somebody stand in front of an audience and talk about the worst thing that was ever done to them. Many of them sharing that for the first time. We did one of these 12 stops in Pellston, down by Harbor Springs in Petoskey, and heard speaker after speaker talk about the Holy Childhood School there and some of the abuses that were carried out. One story I want to share with you, just to illustrate why this is relevant today, was at one of these stops, there was a woman who got up to speak. She was about my age. And she said, I didn't go to one of these boarding schools. And growing up, I always had a hard relationship with my mom. She was really hard on us. And we were never close, and I could never understand why. Why I never had a good relationship with my mom. And she said, I was working at this urban Indian health center out west, and a letter came in. And just by nature of her job, the letter came to her, of all people. And she said she opened it up, and this woman was trying to find her best friend from boarding school, from when she was a kid. She was an elder, and she wanted to reconnect. And she heard that her friend might be living in this area, and so she sent the letter to the Urban Indian Health Center, thinking they'll be able to help me find someone who knows this person. And so the woman who was speaking said that in that letter there was a picture, and it was a picture of her mom. And her mom had attended boarding school with this woman, and she never knew. Her daughter never knew her mom went to boarding school. And it clicked. She said her whole life, everything up until that moment made sense because she knew what her mom had gone through. And then her mom stood up to speak. And for the first time in her life, shared her experience at that boarding school and the abuse she suffered. So this isn't just in the past. When people went to these schools, their families were separated, they were disconnected from each other. It affected their relationships with their kids. We heard over and over stories like that. My parents were mean to me. My mom was abusive. I never got hugged. My dad was an alcoholic. People my age, people younger than me, living today, we heard these stories over and over again. And this was all carried out under the banner of the federal policies of the United States. And it affects people today, which is why we're doing this work. So we're finishing up our second volume of this investigative report, and we're going to try to identify a few other things. One is we're going to try to put a number on how much money the federal government spent on these schools. We're going to try to identify how many kids went to these schools and how many kids never went home. And we're going to try to find where those burial sites are. A lot of them are now in private ownership. A lot of them are unmarked. And so obviously, like all of us, we want to protect the final resting place of our ancestors, particularly our ancestors who were kids. And so that's something that we're working on. And, you know, we're trying to pave the way with recommendations for the future on how to address the legacy impacts of these schools. So I know that in these times, it's often challenging to have public discourse about our history. People say, why are you trying to make me feel guilty? We're not trying to make anybody feel guilty. But for people that we met along this tour, to have the United States of America recognized and affirm that their own lived experiences were real means something. And for the United States to affirm that their own lived experiences were carried out as a public policy of this country, that's been cathartic for many people. And we can begin to work together to heal, to do things like reunify Indian families, to help Indian people reclaim their languages, to improve the relationship between the United States and tribes and local communities with their neighboring Native communities, and to really have a good relationship between Indian people and the United States. And we've already seen that our work has borne fruit. So the United States Supreme Court earlier this year ruled in a case, there was a challenge to a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act, which, you know, this is, I don't have enough time in this symposium to get into all these different permutations, but there was a challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was a law passed just a few years before I was born that said we cannot no longer take Indian kids away from their families without involving the tribes. And so people were challenging this and saying that's illegal racial discrimination to favor tribes in foster care child placement. So the Supreme Court actually upheld this law. And it surprised a lot of people because the people who brought this challenge, they thought, well, the politics have changed, so we're going to win this case. But that decision was rooted in the Constitution that I was talking about. It crossed party lines. Justice Gorsuch was aligned with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on this case. And at the oral arguments, I was able to attend that. That was the first time I'd ever been to the Supreme Court for oral arguments. And it was scheduled for an hour, and it went almost 4 hours. Went over 3 hours. And there were so many questions about boarding schools. If the federal, and questions along the lines of if the federal government had the legal authority that we've already said they had to take Indian kids and change their culture, don't we also have the legal authority to protect those Indian kids and their ability to stay with their families and their communities and their culture? And the Supreme Court said yes. And in their written opinions, they cited to our boarding school report many times. I mentioned earlier that the historical policies of taking Indian lands and forcibly assimilating Indian people, and it's really hard to overstate the modern impact of those policies that we're living with. I've just described that for you. There's not a single Indian person today in this country who isn't affected somehow by those policies. Every single Indian person that you've ever met is carrying around the legacy of that, whether it's not knowing their language or being separated from their families or having a diminished land base, all of those things. And so we have now entered this policy area in the United States where we've said, with the Indian Child Welfare Act, we refute that. We repudiate that policy. Our policy now is tribal self-determination. Our policy is keeping Indian kids with their families, and our policy is one of cooperative federalism on a government-to-government relationship. And that policy occurs on a bipartisan basis. It's not a Democratic policy. It's not a Republican policy. It's the policy of the United States. That policy has been instituted and carried out by President Reagan, President Bush, President Trump, as well as President Obama, and the president I work for, President Biden. So in contrast, it's a marked contrast now from the era that we're talking about with the Lewis Cass expedition, where we're talking about forcible assimilation and taking Indian lands. We're now talking about this self-determination, supporting tribes governing themselves. And this is all rooted in our trust responsibility, which is rooted in the U.S. Constitution and all the treaties that were negotiated between the United States and these tribes. And it's fundamentally different from other relationships in this country. It's not like the relationships that cities have with counties. It's not like the relationship that counties have with states or states have with the federal government. It's unique unto itself. And so, you know, when I was growing up, sometimes people would say, you Indians, you always think you have these special rights. And I learned to say, yeah. And they're special because this is a special relationship. It doesn't exist anywhere else. And that's something we should be proud of, that our country, here in the United States, has the capacity, our founding documents as a country, has the capacity to recognize this special relationship and turn it from something bad and dark and painful into something collaborative and cooperative, where we have a shared project and we recognize the unique status of one another and respect it instead of trying to erase it. And so we're working now in President Biden's administration to make sure that we carry forward this new policy era, to make sure that tribes are not just the country club full of Indians, that it's not the Rotary Club full of Indians, that tribes are recognized and respected as sovereign governments within our constitutional structure, and that we're working to make life better for Indian people like we do with all Americans. So we've done a lot of work in this administration to carry out this new policy under the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act. We've been able to invest $45 billion into Indian country. So for some perspective, the annual budget for the Bureau of Indian Affairs is 1/15 of that amount. So in 2 years, this administration has invested 15 years worth of BIA funding into Indian country. It's an unprecedented amount of federal investment in Indian country. And that money goes to things like schools, health centers, bridges, roads, all the stuff that governments need to do to take care of their people. And that money is also beginning to flow to things like native language revitalization, going to support tribes in their work. And we were talking about this with Keynote leaders this morning, supporting efforts to keep tribal languages alive, because those languages aren't just the way that we communicate our ideas, that we express our excitement over the Detroit Lions beating the Green Bay Packers. Our language, no matter what culture you're in, your language carries forward your cultural values. It carries forward your way of life, your way of relating to one another, your way of interacting with the world. And so if our trust responsibility at the United States federal government is to protect the existence of Indian people and their ability to exist as Indian people, we've got to make sure that Indian people can continue to exist as Indian people. And that includes making these investments in tribal language revitalization, so that those cultural teachings, those knowledge, the way of relating to one another, that we, the United States, worked so hard for 2 centuries to erase, we've got to undo that. And we're beginning to do that work with some of this funding that I just described. So I want to make sure that I, again, express my gratitude to all of you for the opportunity to come talk about this work. It's some of the most meaningful work I've ever done in my life, and probably ever will do. And I've got my partner here, Sam Cohn, in the back. He's a policy advisor in our office who helps advance a lot of these policies. This has been rewarding work, and not only rewarding work to do as a Ojibwe guy from the UP, it's rewarding work to do as an American, because this is healing work to make our nation a better place. And so I know that this symposium is focusing on Lewis Cass, and I'm not here to tell you all the ways that all the bad things that he did, because history and people are complex. But it certainly, his work changed the course of life and existence for our country, and that includes the first peoples here as well. You know, we are working to, if you think about the arc of history over millennia, you know, the last 2 centuries is pretty small. There was a lot done there, but it makes us optimistic about the potential for what can be, right? Because there's a long period of peace and good relationships. There's this period of conflict. And now through this work, through understanding our history, acknowledging it, and working to heal from it, we can make this arc of history, this time span in history going forward, a peaceful one, one of good relationships, so that this bad stuff that nobody likes to talk about or think about is confined to this narrow band of history. And so I think this symposium is an opportunity to reframe that, to think about it, acknowledge where we've been, and commit to doing better in the future. So I want to say miigwech, thank you to all of you for your time, for having me here today, for listening, and I think we've got time for a few questions.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I don't have my hearing aids in, I can. I was wondering, I was doing some ethnohistory work in the far western UP with the Lac-Vieux Desert tribe, and I found out that many of their children were sent to Harbor Springs, Holy Child School, far away. Distance really was problematic for these kids because it separated them. But I was wondering about the boarding schools in Baraga, where the children were in relative close proximity to their own communities. Did that have a different effect where they were able to still maintain cultural ties?
You know, that's a great question. One of the things that I've learned going through this experience is that the experiences of communities around the country was, you know, there were some common threads, but there were differences as well. One of the things that we heard a lot of, and we've seen through our team's research, is that the choice to send kids to schools far away was often deliberate, because many of these schools, kids would want to run away. So if you made it hard for them to run away to go home, it was more likely that they were going to stay there. But there were places where kids were sent to these schools in their communities or close by. I can't speak to any specific example about whether that enabled them to retain their language or their culture better. I suspect, if anything, I mean, I'm assuming many of you are parents like me, that it just gave some assurance to their families knowing they were close by as opposed to far away. But, you know, it was different in each one. Just another example from that prompted me to think of another example from our history or our work, listening to folks across the country. A few weeks ago, I was in Anchorage, Alaska. I travel a lot. My hair was really dark when I started a few years ago. We heard from people up there describe that in a lot of these villages, the adults would talk about how quiet the villages were because all of the kids were gone. And those are things that we don't think about. So I imagine if your kids were taken to school down the street, as a parent, that probably feels a lot better than your kids being put on a boat or a train and shipped across the country. But I don't have any specific examples of folks that I can recount for you.
Bonjour, Bryan. Marty Reinhardt, Sault Ste. Marie.
Hey, Marty.
So my question is about your anticipation of reparations to the victims and their families for these wrongs that have been done, whether it was boarding schools, sterilizations. I mean, the list goes on. And I know that that's something that probably you've thought about. You've had to thought about just compensation and what that actually means in our context. I just want to get your thoughts about that. Miigwech.
Sure. Miigwech, Marty. It's good to see you again. In our listening sessions going across the country, I can't recall any speaker getting up and saying, I want to be paid, or I want compensation for this. I heard a lot of people stand up and say, I want my kids to know our language. And I heard a lot of people say, I just want to have this truth that I know acknowledged. And I don't know that, on that one, I don't know that you can put a price on that. When it comes to language revitalization and family reunification, we can make these investments, and we're working to do that. But I can't recall a speaker at any one of these standing up and making a demand for reparations, because I think, and I'm not discounting, folks who want to talk about those things, but I think that for most people across Indian country, in my experience going through this, people want to heal from it and want a better relationship, and I think there's an acknowledgement that takes more than money. It takes work in a relationship. And so, we've heard what people have said too about, I want my kids to speak their language. But I will add, just that I thought I knew a lot of stuff about this subject coming into this work. And when I took this job, we weren't anticipating necessarily taking this on the way that we did. Growing up over in Bay Mills, we went to school in Brimley. The school is half native, half not. And when I go home and talk with people I grew up with who aren't native, it's amazing to me, like how many people I've known my whole life, never heard of this, never heard of it. And it boggled my mind, because just a few miles down the road in my community of Bay Mills, like it's just common knowledge. Everyone had relatives go to these boarding schools, and then my friends I grew up with, it wasn't malicious. They didn't know. And I think about that, and it makes it click for me what a lot of people have said. So talk about wanting people to affirm their truth. Like, think about all the times in your life when you know something to be true. Like you've seen it, you've touched it, you've experienced it, and somebody says, I don't believe you. Like, that's maddening, right? When you say, I experienced this thing. I was in the woods and I saw Bigfoot. Maybe not that, but I experienced something and nobody believes me. And that makes you feel less than. It robs you of your dignity. You don't have to be Indian to know what that feels like, because we've all felt it at some point in our lives. And for a lot of Indian people going through this road to healing, having a cabinet secretary of the United States federal government stand up and say, this happened. People have been waiting their whole lives for that.
With intermarriage and complicated genealogies, who qualifies as an Indian?
That's a great question, and that's one we were talking about in the car ride over here. Indian identity is complicated. And I think first and foremost, the first people who should get to decide are Indian people. And tribes have different standards for what we call tribal enrollment or tribal citizenship now. And there's, as sovereign governments, like any sovereign nation on this planet, they have the right and the authority to define the terms of their citizenship. But Indian country is a really diverse place, too. I mean, we often think of intermarriage. There are people, when I travel, they say, "You don't look Indian to me." And Indian people look like a lot of things. There are people who are Indian, Native, and Hispanic. There are people who are Native and Black. There are people who are light-skinned. My son has a really good friend from Bay Mills. They're both the same blood quantum. You would look at my son and you would never guess that, maybe never think that he were Indian, and he'd look at his good friend and say, "Oh my God, that guy's full blood. He must be like, he must go way back in his family." But you can't determine these things by the way people look and identity, or by the language, whether they speak their language or whether they practice their traditional religious practices and ceremonies. Because of this history that I just walked through, it's complicated. And so the place to start is to allow Indian people and Indian tribes to determine those questions.
Question. Is the report that you're talking about, is that online? Is it in
Yes.
hard copy?
Both.
How is it available?
It's available on the website of the Department of the Interior, along with the list of all of the schools, and we're working to provide more information. I have to say, our team of researchers, sometimes I wish I could spend all day talking about these things, but our team of researchers, most of the people at the Department of the Interior who are doing this work are Indian themselves. And the folks who are going through these records, and page after page of, Indian kid, dead. It has been incredibly hard on them. So you think about the physical task of going through 98 million pages of documents. Some of them are onion skins, so they have to be like, you can't pick them up. And then, and that's to say nothing of the subject matter of these. The work that our team has done on this has just been remarkable. And it's been an emotional labor for them as well. And to sit and listen to people tell their stories. It is just, it's an incredible story, and I think the people who've done this work to get to these reports that are publicly available, I can't commend them enough. I'm really proud of them.
It's such an incredible honor that you are here, Secretary Newland. Thank you so much. And to Dan Truckee and everybody, what an incredible honor you're here at Northern today. Thank you. I wondered if you knew that the state of Michigan, Governor Whitmer just reissued an RFP through the Department of Civil Rights. They haven't found a leader yet to lead the research for state of Michigan boarding school research. And I wondered if you know of anyone. They, 2 weeks ago, just reissued this and have added another $750,000. So hopefully we'll find someone to do this research directly in our state. And if you know anyone, send them to Lansing, if you please.
That's great to know, actually. I mean, I was aware of the first RFP, and I kind of heard rumblings that they were having a hard time finding someone. But, one of the things that's been great about this work, so when you look back a few years, when in Canada they discovered this mass grave at the Kamloops school, and that triggered this kind of awakening of like, it was very traumatic for a lot of people, even here in the United States, and it triggered this call to like, we know here in the United States we've got to do something about it, and it led to the work that we're doing. And that has led now to local and statewide efforts to focus on what you're describing. And we're the federal government, so we can do things a mile wide, but often an inch deep, right? And so to really know the unique history, a lot of this work has to be done at the community level, at the regional, and at the state level. And so I'm really glad to see the state taking that on. We've seen this in a number of places with religious institutions and dioceses and universities and state agencies, and just at the community level, talking about one school taking on this work. And it's been really impressive to see. And we often don't have a sense of history until you get to look back at it after a while, but I think we're going to look back at this moment and see a turning point in the beginning of a healing process. So I'm really glad to see that work.
You may have just answered the question. However, looking back on your experience, what do you feel was a pivotal point where people started to focus on this is an issue that we need to deal with, as opposed to what popular media over time projected on the 6 o'clock news? And then the second part of that is, what forces do you have pushing back against trying to move forward?
Thank you for that. I think so. With the first question, we can come in. You can always come into a federal job or some government job, some political job, and hand out the grants, turn the lights on, shut the lights off, punch the clock, and that work is important, right? You want government to function. You want it to function well, but you also have a responsibility to address the big things in the future. And as I mentioned, this isn't an academic exercise. We have an ongoing relationship with 574 sovereigns. So you can't, in any relationship, I've been married to my high school sweetheart. We've been together for now a majority of our lives. You can't move forward in a good relationship unless you acknowledge the difficult parts that you've had together and work to heal from them. And so, why is this work being done? It's being done because we've got to heal this relationship we're in together, and you got to do that by building trust with one another. And you only build trust with one another when you affirm a common set of facts between you, and a shared purpose to do better. Your second question, can you repeat that? Oh, thank you. Yeah. I've been grateful and impressed that we haven't received really a lot of pushback, especially considering, some of the discourse around talking about history in books and these things. I've testified. I testify before Congress regularly in this job, and members of Congress from both parties have sponsored legislation to set up a national commission. We've testified in support of that. We've had statements of support from governors and leaders from both parties. I haven't found it to be a partisan issue, and I haven't really encountered a lot of pushback to the extent, I wouldn't even call it pushback. I get a lot of people sometimes ask why is the government doing this? What's the relevance? And then when you explain it, they say, "Oh yes, that makes sense." But again, people don't know, and I think when people don't know something and then they learn it, there's a willingness to look at it, with fresh eyes. So we haven't had decades of partisanship and calcified views around this issue. So I think I've been grateful for people's willingness to engage in this conversation. I think I've got time for maybe two more.
So I'm just wondering, in terms of the ability to do this program and the government's openness, do you see that applying to other cultures, other disenfranchised, like African American?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that applying Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I want to be careful because I've learned the hard way and lessons my parents taught me not to talk too much about things I don't know a lot about. But you know, we've got a complex history here in the United States. The things that relate to the dark parts of our history also point to things that can make for a bright future, because we've got characteristics in this country to correct ourselves and to form around common principles instead of common skin color, right? So I can't speak to whether the federal government, you know, what work has been done on those types of conversations and what should be done. I do know that the relationship between Indian people and the federal government is also a legal relationship. And again, that underpins our work and why we've pursued this effort.
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
Hi. So earlier you mentioned, towards the beginning of your speech, you started talking about the Supremacy Clause and treaties. It's kind of a two-part question. So my first part is, are these treaties that the United States government holds between like tribes here, are these living documents that tribes are actively working with the government to try and amend and continue to change? And the second part of that question is, if they are, does that fall within your purview? Like, is that your job as Assistant Secretary to help work with these tribes and make those changes?
That's a great question. And the answer to both is yes. So I'm going to take my Fed hat off and put on my Bay Millionaire hat, put on my Bay Millionaire Stormy Cromer that I got. You know, when I was tribal president, we were negotiating with the state of Michigan, and I was at the table with Dave here about these issues and how to implement and regulate our treaty fishing rights as a tribe, while the state of Michigan was regulating recreational fishing and other things that relate to the Great Lakes. That's actually built into our federal budget. So there was a lawsuit. I referenced the guy from my tribe who had his net seized and went to the Michigan Supreme Court. That led to a lawsuit that the federal government actually filed against the state of Michigan and said, stop keeping these Indian people from fishing because we have an agreement with them that says they can do this. So the federal government sued the state of Michigan, and my whole life this lawsuit's been going on. And there are periodic court orders and rulings in that. But as part of the different settlement agreements in that, the United States has said we are going to work with tribes in the state of Michigan to support the management of fishing in the Great Lakes. And so the state of Michigan, those 5 tribes, and the federal government meet regularly, and their staff work together to monitor fisheries, water quality, all these types of things. We co-manage the Great Lakes. And every year, we in the Department of the Interior, under our budget, ask Congress to fund that work so that tribes can continue to do that, because that's our obligation as the federal government, to make sure tribes have the tools they need to protect and exercise their rights. So these absolutely are living documents. They're relevant today. There are people in my community who put food on the table, literally and metaphorically, by fishing. That's the case in many parts of the country. There are tribes that have treaty-based rights to things like healthcare and education. We litigate these things all the time, both the federal government and tribes and states. In fact, there was a recent case that the federal government, just won supporting the Northwestern Shoshone Band in Utah and their ability to hunt under their treaty in the state of Idaho. So we actually filed that lawsuit on behalf of that tribe. And that's a live issue that we're still working on and sorting through. So these are very much living documents. Like the Constitution of the United States, it has relevance today. We have to manage these relationships to make sure these treaties are laws. Once the Senate ratifies a treaty, it's the law. And so we've got to implement the law, just the same as we've got to implement the Civil Rights Act and the Clean Water Act and all these other laws. We've got to implement these treaties, and that's work that we do. Thank you.
Secretary Newland, thank you so much for being here today. Such a powerful message.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, and safe travels, and hope the weather is good for you.
I got this for my birthday a couple of weeks ago, and it's been warm in DC. I've been itching for the chance to break it.
Awesome, fantastic.
I've been sending photos back to my parents all morning in different places with my Stormy Cromer hat on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming. All right, everyone. We will be reconvening at 1 o'clock, but like I said, there is some food next door.